my drink.
It is with pleasure
And
that
brought
I
it back.
introduce to you the
But it
third
wasn't.
of the
It belonged
Phillips
to
Theological
the-
Seminary staff members who is with us today. This is Warren Carter, and I think I met Warren when he and others from Phillips filled the pulpit when Todd was taking his sabbatical. I think that was the last time you were here. But anyway, we welcome him this morning and also in the worship service. Betsy asked me to pass this around. She is recruiting helpers during Vacation Church School. So if you are interested in serving on any one of these 3 nights for Bible, I used to call it Bible school, but anyway, for church school, just sign up and pass this around, and you can indicate what night you would like to be involved. And I will turn it over to Warren.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Or morning. Yeah, got to remember there are folks there as well. Well, it's good to be with you this morning. Thank you for inviting me back again. I'm going to begin with a commercial. Shameless, absolutely, utterly. But anyway, I brought a few copies of a recent book that I've just written on early Judaism in the New Testament, troubling misunderstandings. So it looks at some of the ways that we Christians have misunderstood things about Judaism. Sometimes we've done it out of just ignorance, and sometimes we've done it because we're hateful people. So we're trying to address some of those sorts.
Did you bring copies?
I do. I have 4 copies here. It'll cost you $20, which you can either give me as a check or as cash, and it's cheaper than Amazon.
It's cheaper than Amazon.
Cheaper than Amazon. There you go.
All right.
Yeah. All right. Okay, well, this morning I want to use the time that we have to think a little bit about the topic that you see on screen, and you have copies of the slides in front of you as well. Jesus followers in the big wide world. This is an issue that I think is particularly to the fore in our own time, and it's been an issue that the church has wrestled with for its 2,000-year history. How do we engage the big wide world? You can think about some of the stuff that we have in our own time.
Sorry.
That's all right. You can think about some of the issues that we have in our own time and some of what happens in our political media. I guess the classic example from recent times is when senior figures in the administration proceed to tell the Pope that he ought to get his theology lined up.
Yeah.
And once he's learned a bit of theology, he'll know not to be involved in politics. Whatever else you think about the Pope, this Pope is well educated theologically, don't worry. But I think it's kind of interesting that we've got this argument going on in contemporary politics where the Pope is basically being told, keep in your lane, and your lane has to do with religious things and absolutely nothing else. Nothing societal, nothing political. And of course the Pope is saying, well, all of life is tied up in the purposes of God. And so if you're trying to confine me to one thing, it's not going to work. That's just an example from our own time, and I'm not suggesting we now take a vote and decide who's right or whatever, but simply an example from our own time around this particular issue. And what's interesting is that if we look back over the church's history, we see that the church has taken all sorts of different stances or all sorts of different strategies in relation to the big wide world. It's never just been one thing. We've had all sorts of different forms of engagement. So we can't do 2,000 years of church history in 52 minutes this morning. So what I'm going to do is look at, if we have time to do all seven instances from the early church of different forms of engagement with the big wide world. And the big sort of point I want to make is that there is no one strategy that the church has always employed. There's no one way of doing this that the church has always done, but the church has done various things things at various times in its history, and sometimes a number of things simultaneously. A number of strategies by different folks in the church with the same situation, which of course is something of what we have in our own time. So I want to look at 7 events across the first few centuries of the church's existence, 7 moments, if you like, where we see the church negotiating the big wide world in different ways. So just a very quick couple of slides about the Roman Empire to start with, since this is the context in which the early church developed. You can see from the map that we have extensive territory out to the west here. This doesn't show up. It shows up on the wall, which would be good for the cat, but no good here. So in the west we have Portugal and Spain, France, Gaul as it was in the ancient world, going north up into England as we have it across Europe, of course the Italian peninsula through Greece, and out to the east, Syria, Iran, Iraq, heading out there, south through Jerusalem, through Judea, Galilee, and then across the top of Africa. Large deal with Egypt. Egypt was very important for the empire, but across the top of Africa as well. Carthage, of course, was a traditional enemy for the Romans. So we've got a large swath of material, of geography rather, and about 65 million people are the estimates for the population of the empire. 65 million. So, it's a substantial number of people of all sorts of different ethnicities, cultures, traditions, etc. If we had to sort of sum up how Rome did empire, then I think we've got 5 big areas, 5 big domains in which power was asserted. So the first one has to do with territory, as we've just seen from the map. We have claims that everything in the land and the sea belongs to the emperor. Everything in the land and the sea. And of course, it was paid in the Roman world through taxes and tribute, and often folks paid their taxes not in cash, or not by some automatic deduction or payment to the IRS, but paid it in kind, in goods. So you paid a certain percentage of your crop, a certain percentage of your animals. You handed over if you were a small farmer. Secondly, we have societal structures, the way that the society was organised in a very hierarchical way, and I'll show you a map of that in a moment. We also have, of course, various economic policies in place. This was a slave economy. Historians argue about what percentage of slaves made up the empire. Anything, folks suggest, from 10% to about 30%, somewhere in there. A number of folks either taken slaves as captives in war or born into slavery. Subsequently, a slave economy, slaves did a bunch of labour, but most folks in the empire were manual workers, workers with their hands, crafts workers or farmers. Of course, taxes and tribute, as I've already mentioned, basic to the whole economic structure. All of this is tied up with military power and military threat. You do it Rome's way, or else Rome can roll out the legions. And Rome was happy to roll out the legions when it needed to, and of course assert basically male power through the army if necessary. And finally, we have a whole ideological construct going on to get to sort of sanction, to legitimate all of these demonstrations of power. And that was a brief narrative. The gods had chosen Rome as the agent of the gods, and so Rome had the gods' sanction to extend its rule wherever it wanted to. And if you were smart as a subject people, then you simply agreed with that, because after all, you'd be yielding to the will of the gods, and who would want to take the gods on? That would be bad business. So you yielded accordingly. So we've got what folks would talk about as as a domination of both bodies and of minds in terms of subjugating most of this population. Now, if you see any connections between those 5 circles and the contemporary world, well, I think you're probably doing pretty well for a Sunday morning. You know, you can think of the narratives in our own time that justify uses and misuses of power, but we won't go there. So this is what it looks like in terms of the societal structure. This is how human interactions were organized in this empire. It's very hierarchical and it's very patriarchal. So we have 3 blue boxes at the top of this hierarchy. The emperor, senators, and throughout the cities of the empire, the leading folks in each city. So if you're one of the rich persons in Ephesus or in Corinth or in Jerusalem, for example, then you had power in that particular area, and Rome was very happy for local elites to continue to be local elites as long as they supported Rome's agenda, which of course is what happened in the year 66 when a bunch of folks in Jerusalem said, we're not going to cooperate anymore, we're going to go to war, and it turned out disastrously over the next 4 years. So that's the power group. And that power group with wealth and power and status is about 2 or 3% of the population. It's a very small group, 2 or 3% of the population. Then we have sort of a middling group. Folks guesstimate anywhere between 10 and 15% of the population. Bankers, traders, and skilled artisans. Folks who are doing pretty well. They're never going to jump up into the blue boxes. That's not going to happen. They're never going to have enough wealth for that. But they're living comfortably as a middling group. So doing the math, and I'm not very good at math, but somewhere between 15 and 20% of the population. So what about the rest of the population? Well, the rest of the population basically divide into 3 groups of what we would call the poor, and gradations of the poor. So at level 5, we have a bunch of folks living at subsistence level. Level 6, we have folks who live part of the time at subsistence level and other times cycle below it, depending on employment, depending on the market, depending on food supplies, depending on health, etc. And then we have the folks in level 7 who are basically falling out the bottom of society. No safety net. If you're a trades worker, for example, you use your hands. If you have an accident and you ruin your hand or your arm or your leg and you can't work, you're not long for this world, right? I mean, that's how precarious and vulnerable it is for folks, especially in levels 6 and 7. These are folks who might do things like tanners of hides. They might be butchers. They might be weavers. They might be spinners of wool. They might be woodworkers. They might be bakers, right? These are the sorts of folks we're talking about in levels 5 and 6. In level 5, these are folks who've done really, really well. Level 6, these are folks who are just getting by. Level 7, these are folks who have nothing. They might have labour for a while, but if they get injured or if the labour market dries up, then they're not going anywhere either. All right? So that's our brief orientation to the world in which the early Jesus folks made their way. And if we had to put the Jesus folks on this map, this hierarchy here, we would put them in probably levels 5 and 6. We don't have any evidence for anyone in levels 1, 2, and 3, not in the first couple of centuries. Maybe 1 or 2 in the green box, maybe, but most folks in levels 5 and 6, and occasionally in 7. All right? So it's a movement of the poor, of degrees of the poor to start with. Thoughts or observations thus far, or should we move along?
There is no social safety net.
No social safety net. No. You know, your family might be able to help you, but if you're in level 6, then there's not a lot of room for passengers, right?
And there was no upward or downward movement in this.
The big thing about this is that you're trying not to go down. That's the big thing, right? If you're in level 5 and you're doing okay, then you're doing everything you can not to drop to level 6. Nobody wants to be in level 7. But yeah, nobody's pulling themselves up by the sandal straps to get into the blue boxes, for example. You're either born into it or you don't. Yeah.
Were the people in the 2 and 3%, were they born into those
Yeah.
levels? How did people, that was basically a hereditary thing?
Mostly it was hereditary, but they also, of course, had wealth that they had to do something with.
Yeah.
And for much of that wealth, it was an investment in land.
Yeah.
This was a predominantly landed empire, so the more land you had, the more that you could produce. And we know that elite folks had pockets of land all over the place.
Oh, really?
They weren't always contiguous. So you might have, so to speak, 5 or 6 or 7 farms in different places.
So they had a legal system that protected property rights?
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course a lot of that was hereditary, the land was hereditary as well. But we also know that these folks invested some of their wealth in activities like trade and particular crafts, so that they could become sponsors or patrons of, say, a pottery maker. And that pottery maker would then have the opportunity, if there was sufficient cash investment, to really grow a business. And especially with trade around the empire, we know there was a lot of trade. We can trace, pottery made in North Africa that ends up in Rome or ends up in Jerusalem or something like that. There's a lot of trade. Trade, of course, was a precarious business because you put your money into ships and boats, and there were storms. And so you could lose a bunch of stuff to the Mediterranean. So, it was a risk of an investment, but if it paid off, you did pretty well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there are differences with today's way we live, but generally, is this just the way people arrange themselves over the centuries? You'd think we would have by now been doing better than this.
Yeah. No, I think any empire, this is true for Rome's empire, but folks who do sort of study empires across lots of different empires basically come up with the same sort of deal. And I don't think it's very hard to imagine significant similarities with our own time. We would want to say that we have a bigger middling group, and so 5 and 4 would be closer together, I think, in our world, although of course there's a lot of discussion about the shrinking middle class. And of course we've got degrees of poverty very much as well. Plus we have, what do they call the 1%ers?
Yeah.
Yeah, well we've got 2 or 3% here, so that accumulation of wealth amongst the very wealthy.
I think we call it oligarchs.
Yes,
not,
oligarchs.
Senators. And
Yep, exactly, right.
basically the same idea.
So you mentioned about the Jesus people.
Mm-hmm.
Were in the level 5 and 6 mostly.
Right.
How did that message get across? I mean, who did Jesus? The biblical leaders that we have books about in our Bible, are they fitting into these?
Yeah.
These places?
So if we had to put Jesus in this diagram, probably in level 6 as a woodworker.
Okay.
If we had to put Paul into this map, probably also in level 6 as well, as a tent maker or a leather worker, according to Acts chapter 18. Exactly what he's making as a leather worker or a tent worker, we don't really know. But probably in level 6 for Paul. He's not in level 7. He's doing okay. Maybe he creeps to the edge of level 5, but certainly no higher. So this is where most of the Jesus folks would be. I think level 6, occasionally in level 5. But I think in the congregations we would also have folks in level 7, because you asked the question, how did the message get out? One of the ways that the message got out was, and you'll know these passages from the New Testament, when was I hungry and you gave me something to eat? When was I homeless and you gave me a place to live? When was I naked and you clothed me, right? So this injunction on these early Jesus folks to be doing these transforming things in their world was a key thing. Taking care of the sick, for example, in their groups. So that would clearly move them to involvement with level 7 folks, and would be part of the incorporation into the communities as well. Yeah, ma'am, you were trying to
Were
get it.
2 and 3%, were they better educated? What was the educational other than Jesus?
Well, for these folks in the blue boxes, there was pretty good education, especially for males. Now, that's not to say that women totally missed out, they didn't, but there were particularly strong emphases on education for males, and it centered, believe it or not, on rhetoric, where they learned you to speak proper. They learned you to speak well, because you had to be persuasive in your political spheres, in your business, and all those sorts of things. And so we have a number of manuals from the ancient world that set out sort of the curriculum for training young men to speak properly and persuasively. And in those manuals there are even model speeches, so that if you're a leader in a town and an important person comes to visit your town, then here's the sort of speech that you make to welcome that person, right? So we get models of it. So for folks in 2 and 3, we've got a lot of very good formal education. Some of the folks in the green box would get some of that education as well, and then it gradually diminishes as it goes further down the track. Now, Paul, of course, is very literate and educated, but I still think he exists at level 6. So we've got stuff that sort of creeps through the whole system. But one of the ways of measuring that is degrees of ability to write. And they reckon 15 to 20% of this population is literate, able to read and write, but able to read and write changes in definition and capacity as you go further down the hierarchy.
Like we were talking earlier, the ability to move up or down. I know in my 30 years in the workforce, the first 15, the more I worked, the more I got ahead. But I know the last 10 to 15, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Right. Changing economic circumstances and visions. Exactly.
Whether it's overtime or it just never does. We were always taught the harder you work, the more you'll succeed. But it seems like it's fallen off considerably.
Because in this world, even if you're in the green box and you're doing pretty well as a banker, or you're doing pretty well as a trader, you're an entrepreneur, you're never ever going to get out of that status and power to get into the blue boxes. You may actually get a lot of wealth, and your wealth may even match some of the wealth of these folks, but you don't have power and you don't have status, you don't have birth, you don't have connections. We actually have a satire of a guy called Trimalchio who has a ton of wealth, and he's sort of nouveau riche, he wants to try and pass himself off, but he's got no social graces. He's got no connections. He's got no sort of allies.
Sort of like the Beverly Hillbillies.
Right, like the Beverly Hillbillies. That's a really good image. That's a really good image. Very good. I'm going to borrow that. What's your name? DK. I will credit you every time I use that. As DK said.
So what about people like Virgil? Are they at this time?
Yep.
Or-
Yep.
Okay.
So Virgil's actually one of the main propagandists for this whole deal. When he writes the big poem, the Aeneid, it's all about justifying Roman power,
Yeah.
including Jupiter saying to the Romans, "I give empire without end." I mean, that's straight out of Virgil. So he is going to be probably in the third of the blue boxes. Very well educated, very successful, very well connected.
Must be connected.
Which is how he gets to write the Aeneid, because the Emperor Augustus says, "Go to, do it," and he does. Yeah, but we've got to be a little bit careful with that, because, and I've been reading in this recently, out of Egypt, there's a place that you might have heard of because it's been in the media a little bit, a place called Oxyrhynchus, where about 50 or 60, 70 years ago, oh no, actually, sorry, going back about 100 years now and then gradually, some archaeologists found in a trash dump a whole bunch of manuscripts on papyri that had survived nearly 2,000 years. And for the last 100 years, they've been translating these things and finding more of them. And there's all sorts of stuff in this trash dump. There are receipts, there are contracts of people who hire flocks of sheep from a wealthy person, and they contract them. They take this flock of sheep and they try to make a living off shearing it and all that sort of stuff. So we've got contracts, but we've also got manuscript copies of philosophical texts.
Yeah.
Where did they come from? Who was reading these things? And how come they all end up together in a trash dump? So, you know, at least there's some smattering, some trickle down in some places. Not extensive, but at least a little bit, which just sort of troubles my diagram and its nice, neat boxes. Okay? All right. So what do the Jesus folks do with all of this? All right. Well, I'm going to start with Jesus. And, you know, we start in the Christian tradition with an antithetical relationship to the big wide world, because Jesus ends up on a Roman cross. And he ends up on a Roman cross not because God sends an email to the Romans saying, "I want you to crucify this guy because I want to take care of the sins of the world." That's not how it happens. Rather, he ends up on a Roman cross as King of the Jews. That is, the only way that you got to be a provincial king, and I'll go back to the previous one, the only way you got to be a provincial king in here, in this blue box, is if Rome appointed you as a king, as a ruler. That's the only way you got to be a king in the Roman Empire. So we have King Herod, right?
Yeah.
King Herod is appointed by the Romans to be the ruler of Judea. That's the only way you got to be a king.
Now,
So-
when you say Romans, do you mean open elections?
No, just by decree of either the emperor or the senate.
Okay.
Yeah, and in this case it was the emperor saying, you know, you are going to be king, because some of his family had already been exercising power, so he just happened to be born at the right time and the right place, or the wrong place, depending on how you think about it. Jesus and some other folks get known as popular kings. Key word there is popular, right? Other people see them as kings. Other people regard them as sort of figures who have some sort of influence or power, but not Rome. What was the punishment for being a popular king with a following? Execution.
Jews were separated out. at that time?
Well, they weren't totally separated because Herod is appointed by Rome. This is all under Roman rule, and then once the Herods fall apart, we then get Roman governors appointed. So Rome is extending its power over Galilee and Judea, but often in cooperation with local leaders. Rome appointed the chief priests in the 1st century. Yeah. So Caiaphas, we've all heard about Caiaphas, right? He was chief priest for 18 years. What does that tell you? It might tell you that he had a wonderful prayer life, but actually, it tells you more. He knew how to suck up. And he sucked up really well for 18 years. Okay? Now, I'm not making light of that because I think Caiaphas was in a really tough place. He was supposed to be the representative of this native, this local tradition, yet he has to exist within the Roman Empire. He's got to keep his Roman bosses happy. I think it's a tough place to be.
Things haven't changed much, have they?
Well, this is just all ancient history.
I'm sorry.
You're absolutely right. And you remember that we get this label, this notice put on the cross, the King of the Jews. Jesus is crucified as a rebel, as a treasonous rebel for undermining Roman power. And he did that in a number of ways. He announced the presence of the empire of God. Now, empires get very nervous when there are other empires around. Now, of course, that gets translated with a lovely term in the New Testament, the kingdom of God. I do not like that translation. The kingdom of God. It suggests to me fairy tales. You know, a big castle, a damsel in distress with hair coming down to the ground, a fire-breathing dragon, a knight on shining armor on a big white horse. Well, I don't think this is a fairy tale. But I think a much better translation, and a very realistic one, is that he announced the presence of the empire of God, which makes an empire very nervous. He gathered crowds. He had followers. Also makes an empire very nervous. He attacked Rome's allies. You know, Jesus is always in a fight with the Jerusalem leaders. The Jerusalem leaders are allies with Rome. Rome lets them be in power. So we're talking chief priests, leading Pharisees, leading Sadducees, scribes, the elders of the people, right? This is this local authority structure that Rome says, you can keep your power, it's okay, but you've got to play by our rules. And if you don't, we can take care of you very easily, like we can remove you. Okay? So when Jesus attacks these folks, and we have a number of these accounts in the Gospels of fights, then he's attacking not just the local guys, but their Roman bosses at the same time. And all that material in the Gospels that we don't like to read very much, all that eschatological material, you know, the end of the world stuff. Well, whose world is coming to an end? That's Rome's world that's coming to an end, and it's going to be replaced by God's purposes. Now, you know, when you start walking around saying, you know, your time is up, when you've marketed yourself as an empire as the eternal empire, world without end, you get a little nervous. Yeah. And you have to get rid of somebody who's saying that sort of nonsense. You know, people in power can get a little sticky. Yeah, right. I saw it. Yeah. So, you know, I mean, he's a prime candidate for crucifixion, and they take him out. So we begin with this act of hostility, of antithesis between the Jesus movement and Rome. That's where it starts. Well, moving to a second event. Thank goodness there's the Apostle Paul, and CNN was there to take a picture. So we're 20, 25 years down the track now with Paul. And we have this passage in Romans 13 that people often appeal to. Oh, Christians always have to subjugate themselves, always have to submit to the state. And people appeal to Romans 13. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct. And so he goes on, but I ran out of screen.
You did.
Yeah. So, this is often the text that people appeal to. 25 years after the time of Jesus, Christians have to submit. Well, that's only a little part of the story, because if we did read on, the only kind of so what that Paul mentions is you've got to pay your taxes. That's his only practical so what around submitting to the ruling authorities. You've got to pay your taxes. He goes on to talk about loving people, and he goes on to talk about God judging the world. Now, whenever we read that word world, we're talking about the Roman Empire. So even within chapter 13, it's not quite clear as, yes, you've always got to agree and submit to the government. It's not always that clear. But also it's not clear because in the previous chapter, chapter 12, not very good at math, but 12 comes one before 13, I think. Do I get a witness on that? All right. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, not the will of Rome, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Now, this is the immediate chapter before it. All right? So, whatever he's going to say in chapter 13 is contextualized by what he says here in chapter 12. Now, people say, well, Paul doesn't have a clue, he doesn't know how to make up his mind, he's just all confused. I don't think Paul's confused. I think he's trying to negotiate a difficult situation and make his way, and his Jesus followers make their way in this world where a number of strategies are necessary. So yeah, you pay your taxes, but that's not the whole story. There's a much larger thing. Be transformed in relation to the will of God. It's a larger commitment. So that's 25 years down the track. Now we're going to jump another 25 or 30 years and to the time when the Gospels are written, late in the first century, the 80s or the 90s. And I've taken some examples from Matthew's Gospel. And if we read Matthew's Gospel thinking about it in relation to the Roman Empire, then we'll see there are lots of pieces of empire in this Gospel. So, you know the saying from Jesus, render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God. That's all about paying taxes. But there are a bunch of stories in Matthew's Gospel that use slaves as examples. I think this is a particularly distressing part of the Gospel, that simply the institution of slavery is taken over and used to make teaching points, but there's absolutely no critique of it. No critique of it whatsoever. It's simply assumed as an acceptable institution. Now we can kind of excuse that just about nobody in the ancient world was criticizing slavery, we can say that. But gee whiz, it's not a good heritage for us to inherit, that this institution is just okay. It's not. We've got a lot of attention to land and to land owners in the Gospel. Think about some of those parables. The guy who owns land and then goes away, gives the folks talents to invest, for example, and then comes back. We've got tons and tons and tons of sick folks in the Gospel. Ever wondered why there are so many sick folks in the Gospel? Jesus is always healing folks. Well, what's that?
Nothing.
There were a lot of people who were sick.
There were a lot of people who were sick. How did they get to be sick? Well, if you're poor, we know this. If you're food insecure, and you don't get good nutrition, then you don't have immunity to diseases. And in a world where there's no understanding of how bugs and germs are transmitted, then there's a whole ton of transmission through the population. You know, one of the things that folks were prescribed to do when they were sick and say had bodily injuries were to go to the town baths and bathe in the warm water along with everybody else. How's that for screaming heebie-jeebies? But they didn't know. They didn't know. So, and again, I mentioned earlier, you know, if you're a manual worker, if you're a woodworker, and you splice your hand open, or you're doing some other sort of manual work, like maybe you're unloading boats on the Tiber River, or you're hauling around building materials, and you damage your leg, and you can hardly walk, let alone lift anything. You're in trouble, and your household's in trouble as well. So we have a lot of sick people, diseases of deficiency and contagion. We have a lack of food, clothing, housing, all these things that the gospel names as simply reflection of living in the Roman Empire. But we have contest as well. So the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, your empire come. That's a bit subversive. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And you hear the subtext, right? Your will, not the emperor's, be done. Your empire, not Rome's, come. That's the subtext. But of course you don't have to say it out loud. You can just pray it. Give us daily bread. Why? 70% of the population are food insecure. We want some daily bread. So we've got a prayer that contests basic aspects of Roman power. We've got a mission that disciples are sent on: proclaim good news, cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, and cast out demons. Well, that's just a massive agenda of social transformation. And we want it done by this afternoon.
Right.
Care for the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, those in prison. In other words, the disciples are given this job of repairing the damage that Roman rule does to people. And I don't think that's too hard for us to make a leap to our own time around that. Government decisions and policies can have devastating effect on people. And this whole structure of empire worked really well if you're in the 2 or 3%. But it didn't work well for everybody else. And so the disciples, the followers, are sent to do this sort of mission work. And of course, we have this big thing of eschatology or teleology hanging over everything. Jesus is going to come back, the Roman world is going to end, God's purposes are going to be established, and that's going to be a good thing for most of the population, but not for the folks in power. And you know as well as I do, long before it was a movie, but when the empire is threatened, the empire strikes back. Always. And it's happening in our own time. All right, so again, we don't have one strategy here in terms of making your way in the big wide world. You know, disciples are to do a number of things. It's a juggling act. There are times to cooperate, there are times to resist. There are various ways of resisting, just as there are various ways of cooperating. There's a whole mixture here. Perhaps we'll go to a number 4. How are we doing for time? Oh yeah, we should be done by lunchtime. Number 4, the book of Revelation, right at the end of the 1st century. And I think this is the most Roman document that we have in the New Testament. I know there's all sorts of wacky nonsense out there about the book of Revelation, but I think it actually makes sense in the late first century. I even wrote a book about it once upon a time. Another shameless commercial, but I only brought one copy, so.
We have to explain this.
What does Revelation reveal? Well, what I think it reveals is this: as far as the writer of Revelation is concerned, any sense of being at home in the big wide empire is bad and wrong. You cannot accommodate to this empire. I think that's the big message. And it starts off in Revelation chapters 2 and 3 with that message being presented to 7 churches. It's the same thing over and over again. You have nothing to do with the idolatry of this empire. You don't get mixed up in it. Now, exactly what the writer wants them to do is another question, and that's pretty troubling to answer. Subsequently, he says to them, come out from the empire. Well, where are they supposed to go? New Zealand? I mean, who knows? I mean, where are they supposed to go? And how are they supposed to live? How are they supposed to survive? So there's a ton of passion, but there's not much of a program. And when there's no program, the people perish. So the writer says, don't participate in the imperial society. And clearly some Jesus folks were. Some Jesus folks were accommodating. I mean, how else were they going to survive? So we've got kind of a culture wars thing going on here, with different teachings in the church. And what I think happens in the rest of Revelation, and I'll just do this very quickly because of time, is that after chapter 3, which is the last of the little letters to the 7 churches making this point, don't accommodate, come away from, I think the rest of the book of Revelation, the writer makes 6 big arguments to say, see, I'm right, to try to persuade them. And the first of those arguments is true worship focuses on God as creator and Jesus as savior, not idols. That's the first argument. The second argument is that this Roman world is already under God's judgment. So why would you want to make friends with it? Why would you want to accommodate to it? Why would you want to be at home in it? It's already under God's judgment. Third argument. It does have a chance to repent. It can change its ways. God's given it a chance and is giving it a chance to repent, but that doesn't seem to be working out. Number 4, fourth argument. The Roman Empire is in the hands of the devil. This is a devilish empire. It's utterly antithetical to God's purposes. Now, Revelation isn't the only book in the New Testament that makes that claim. You remember in the temptation stories in Matthew and Luke, when the devil comes to Jesus and says, if you just bow down and worship me, I will give you all the empires of the world. I, the devil, will give you all the empires of the world. In other words, all the empires of the world are in the devil's hands. Now, CNN Rome was probably not broadcasting that. Right. I mean, that's a scathing condemnation of the empire. Utterly scathing. It's all in the hands of the devil. So, the implication, why would you want to accommodate with it? Why would you want to try and be at home in it? You can't be. It's in the hands of the devil. Time is up for the eternal empire, so God's judgment is imminent, is the 5th argument, and then the final piece of Revelation is a vision of what it looks like when God's empire is established. We get a bunch of scenes at the end of Revelation. I often think of the end of Revelation as being like sort of an art gallery, and the artist is exhibiting on one theme of a bunch of different paintings. That's what I think is happening in the last part of Revelation. The big theme is God's empire is going to be established, but we get a bunch of different pictures of what that looks like at the end of Revelation. I think it's a scathing condemnation of Rome's empire across Revelation. I think it makes sense. I think we've done so many wacky things with it over 2,000 years, but I think it does actually make sense. How are we doing for time? Oh yeah, we've got a few minutes. Any thoughts before we pick up the last little pieces?
When you say God's empire, are you saying Jewish? His people?
I'm saying that it partly draws on Jewish traditions, but it's a vision of God's purposes for the world, for everybody. And so we have a number of visions from Jewish folks who envisioned this, but also, the Gospels do their own thing with it. So I think the healings, for example, are sort of anticipations of a world where there's not going to be any more disease and sickness. Those events of over-catering, 5,000 people, 4,000 people, and there's so much left over at the end, the baskets full. So it's a big vision of plenty, of fertility, of abundance. I think that's sort of another vision of what it looks like when God's purposes are established, where good life is available for all, where there's no longer food insecurity. So, some of that feeds on, bad pun, some of it feeds on Jewish traditions, but it's not just for Jewish folks, it's for the whole world. And in terms of Christian thinking, that all stems from the creation story. God makes the world, and what's God's verdict on it? I did okay? No. God declares it is all very good. And so, in a sense, there's sort of an understanding of a return to a world that is abundant, that is healthy, where there is no longer conflict and war. So the lion and the lamb can lie down together without the lion thinking, snack. So it's that sort of world of peace, of abundance, of good life for all people, not just for a few. Okay, all right, we've still got a couple of minutes. Now, let's jump ahead a century, and we're into the 200s now. And in the 200s, we get two events that really rock the boat in the form of persecutions. Now, we're going to be a little bit careful with this word. If you watch the History Channel and they do programs on the Roman Empire, they always tell you two big lies. One, that everybody who lived in the Roman Empire was prosperous. That's a big lie, as we've seen. And secondly, second big lie is that the Romans persecuted the Christians all the time. No, they didn't. You notice I haven't used the P word up till now at all. We don't have empire-wide persecutions of Christians until we get to the 3rd century. And then the persecutions are not particularly directed at things Christians believe, but they're directed against something that the Christians are not doing. Let me explain. So we have this guy, Septimius Severus. I wonder if anyone ever called him Timmy. Not twice. Septimius Severus. And he was the emperor, but the empire was struggling in the 3rd century. How to hold this great mass of land and people together was an increasing problem through the 3rd and 4th centuries. And the empire became more and more fragile as the time went on. And Septimius Severus decided, I've got to find a way to unify this. I've got to find a way to hold all of this together. And picking up on a long tradition, he thought, okay, we've got to get back to a position of the favor of the gods blessing us. We've got to secure that again. So he passes an edict saying everybody has to worship the sun god, Sol Invictus. unconquered Son, understood to be a God, God of life. Everybody has to worship. Well, the Christians said, mostly, no thanks. And Jewish folks mostly said, no thanks. We'll worship our own God, thank you very much. Well, Septimius said, no, that's not acceptable. You can worship your own God, but you're going to pay homage to Sol Invictus first of all. Then you can worship whatever gods you like. But we're all going to be worshipping this God. So, that didn't work out very well if you were a Jewish person or a Christian person, if you believed that there was one God and I'm only going to be loyal to that one. Now, how much persecution of these folks there was, we don't really know. There was some, but how extensive, how severe, and how long-lasting, we don't really know. And of course, there were other folks who didn't want to do this either because they thought it was a lot of nonsense or they weren't going to do what they were told, whatever. So how extensive, we don't really know. But it sort of disappears in a hurry. It doesn't have any staying power. So Septimius has this little outburst of enthusiasm, but not much of a plan to go with it. Well, 50 years later, we have another guy comes along, the Emperor Decius. And he's Emperor 249 to 251. And he thinks, that guy Septimius, he had a good idea. He just failed to execute it properly. And so Decius makes the same sort of analysis. The empire is struggling, things are falling apart, we've got conflict, we've got attacks from other groups, we're not doing very well, we need to get back to getting the favour of the gods. So he makes an edict that people have to sacrifice to the gods and burn incense before a statue of Decius. That's what he demands. And this is where he goes a step further than Septimius. When you do so, you get a certificate saying you have done so. So now there's accountability, which Septimius didn't have. Now there's accountability. And so for 3 years, because Decius dies in 251, for 3 years he and his imperial officials set about trying to enforce this decree and checking up that people have their papers. Does that sound vaguely familiar?
They have counterfeiting in those days.
Yes, absolutely, because this is what Christians did. Some complied. I'll give you the $20 that I said I'd give you if you asked the right question. Some Christians complied. Some agreed. Some didn't. Some were pressured under, I put pressure there, but torture, or social pressure from other folks to make the sacrifice. Others got fraudulent certificates. They counterfeited them, absolutely, as a way of trying to get around this. Some fled, and some died because they refused to cooperate. So again, we don't have one Christian response. We have at least 5 Christian responses to this situation. What to do? 5 responses. We're about out of time, aren't we? Do I have 1 minute?
Yeah, however much time you want to
I got 1
go
minute.
over, you can.
Just 1 minute.
Yep.
All right, now, this caused a big pastoral problem after Decius died in 251. Because what was the church to do now with folks who had, as they use the word, lapsed? The folks who had sacrificed. What was the church to do with them now? Because other folks had died. What do you do? Other folks have been imprisoned. You could sense that there might be some resentment here towards lapsed folks who thought they could just walk back into the church. What did forgiveness look like in this
Mark,
situation?
they canonized them.
Some got martyred and some got canonized, exactly. But others didn't. Others got ostracized. What to do? And so the church tried to come up with different schemes. There was a lot of debate. Do they have to be baptized again? Could they be admitted to communion? Could they be allowed to take communion? Did they have to do 6 months of some sort of penance before this could go on? Big pastoral problem. Last thing, I said some folks fled rather than cooperate. And so, starting in the 3rd century, and it lasts for the next 5, 6, 7 centuries, in fact, even into our own time, really, we have what we would call the monastic movement. So folks would flee into desert areas, into wilderness areas, and they would kind of live an isolated, a totally detached life as much as possible. The big hero here is a guy by the name of Simon Stylites, and you can see on the screen there one of the images from the ancient world about Simon. Simon withdrew and sat on a big pillar of rocks. And he sat there for 37 years. And I don't know if you can see very clearly, but you can see a rope here with a basket. So folks would come thinking he was a really holy dude. I mean, you know, he's really, really holy if he can do this and sit on this pile of rocks. And they'd put food in his basket, and he'd pull up the rope and pull up the basket, and so he'd eat some food, and then he'd lower his basket again, and some other folks would come along and do the same sort of thing. 37 years on a pile of rocks. As someone has said, it's the first agony column in history. Because folks would gather around the bottom and they'd call up to Simon and say, you know, I've got this particular problem in my marriage, or I've got this particular problem in my business. Can you give me a solution? You know, he's a holy guy. He's close to God. He's supposed to have answers. And so we have this. He's the most famous. But also, at the same time as all of this is happening, we have the beginning of communal monasteries. So, you know, you can do it on your own, but maybe you can do it more effectively in a group of people with monasteries. But how do you support the monastery? Well, you better produce some stuff off your land and go sell it in the local markets. You better bake some bread. You better raise some sheep. You better shear them. You better raise some cows. You know?
Make some wine.
Make some wine. Excellent idea. I mean, you've got to do these sorts of things. So as much as they're trying to escape, they can't get away. They're still embedded in local economies. All right, we need to leave it there. So we're running out of time. I was going to talk about Constantine, but you can look at the slides. We know what happened. You know all about him. All right, thank you very much.
Thank
you.
Very inspiring.
Professor Carter, would you close us in prayer?
Surely.
Thank you.
Okay. Enjoy your week.
Thank you.
You too.
Lord our God, we thank you for this long tradition that we inherit of folks who have wrestled with these questions, have wrestled with what it means to be faithful in these circumstances. Some of this we find helpful, some of this we're just surprised by or shocked by. Help us in our own context to discern what faithfulness looks like here in our particular context. Be with us in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Well, one thing I wish you